please welcome back Sunil and Stefan. Thank you. That's okay. And new to the show today, please welcome the CEO behind Silicon Valley Consulting, the California-based consultancy behind MarTech tools and ad tech platforms, and that is Shane Austrie. Hi, Shane. Right, okay, so we are going to have a discussion around technology strategy. Obviously, if you have any questions, we will be sending a microphone around at the end of the session, and I can take any questions on my iPad as well, delivered through the power of technology. Okay, so to start with, now this is something we talked about in some of our earlier sessions, actually, digitalization of large-scale organizations, and I'm thinking of the British Army here in particular. How much of a challenge is that? And is it a case that the bigger you are, the harder that is? So, Stefan, I'll turn to you first.
You know, that's kind, yeah. I mean, I think the short answer is yes, but probably there's some reasons behind that. I did allude to it earlier, you know, we're a brownfield site. We are very, very complicated already. So we have a fair amount of legacy debt, you know, that we've invested in systems, but we've not managed our architecture in a way that means that they work together. We were just talking out the back there, actually, about the fact that we've lost sovereignty over some of our data and some of our IP as well, the intellectual property around what we do as an organization. And so it's almost that the first challenge is to solve those issues before you can even start doing digitalization, before you can start improving. And that feels like it's just wasted energy sometimes. It's really hard because you're having to just catch yourself up to where you should have been. So that's the first issue with a large organization, and in particular a large one that has lacked governance at the center. The second one is leadership, and it comes back to, I think, the McKinsey's report that I touched on earlier. I think the first bullet, the first conclusion they drew was, you have got to have senior leadership buy-in from digital savvy individuals. So, you know, I've got a board, an executive board, which I get to speak to every quarter. We sit in we sit it as a digital board as opposed to it being about the rest of the business. And those leaders are really keen to get on with digitalization, but they've got to find extra time in their diary, extra time in their people's diaries, you know, space in the business to make the changes. That's the other problem. When you're big and very tightly wired like we are, it's finding the space to change and the freedoms to do that. So those two for me are the biggies. I won't hog the stage. I'm sure that my learned friends can help me out with some advice and guidance.
Well, definitely. With your first point, I know from personal experience and working with several clients that the number one reason consulting projects fail is because of poor planning. When you jump into, let's say, digitalizing a whole entire org, the things that you will face is that you'll see certain parts of the data aren't connected together. They're just individual silos. Some things actually require permission that takes weeks or even months to honestly get granted. And overall, you really have to know what you plan to achieve moving forward with this project. And if the case is that you would like to monetize your data, would you like to better use it in the future just for your own good without monetizing it? All of these things actually need to be addressed, clarified, and agreed upon way before the actual work is being done, either internally or by consultants.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sunil.
So I'll try to come up with a different answering as well, right? So I think, yeah, we understand the issues that it's difficult to become digital, but I think it's more to do from a strategy point of view. If you think about it from a three-pronged approach, at the top, it's around strategy. So most of these large organizations always had a core competency created, and you can actually follow what Michael Porter says as well, right? So these companies have large economics of scale, which means they possibly may be one of the low-cost providers of a particular service. Second, they may have a global reach and customer base, which is very difficult for a new company to disrupt. So as long as that large company is profitable, continues to grow revenues, they don't worry about digitalization. The second level then comes in terms of their current business model. If their current business model already is invested in terms of large brick and mortar stuff, it's again difficult for them to change because their incremental cost to serve a customer is very, very low, even if a new incumbent comes with a digital strategy. Or so they end up either buying a particular startup or they attempt killing a particular startup. And if both of these don't work, the third is where they suddenly realize, I'm a large company, but I'm in a situation I can't anymore compete. And that's where they think, okay, now I need to take a digital strategy. Now I need to do something else. But that's where this challenge comes. It's difficult for large organizations to change overnight because of the way they have in terms of their skill sets, their processes, their technology, and the mindset of the people as well. So it's a prolonged approach why large organizations have such a big resistance to digitalization. And I think that is changing only when there is a need to change or a big pain point that they have to change.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Just quickly. I think there's two really great points in there around. So you talked about monetizing again, which we've talked about offline a little bit, and you talk about what is the reason for doing it, within those different stratas. I think if you understand the benefit of going through the process, that's great. But to me, benefits have become quite complicated, more complicated than they ever were before, because previously they were just more bottom line almost. But there's much more to life now than that. If you're going to be a successful organization, there's a whole load of stuff. I think you were talking about diversity yesterday. We're talking about sustainability now as a really big benefit that we want to go after. We talk about benefit in terms of bizarre things like being able to outcompete that I talked about earlier, which is a really weird benefit. How much can you outcompete? It does relate back to the commercial sector slightly in terms of not being consumed by another business or outcompeted. But I think that benefits analysis is a challenge. The management consultancy string of the world, they're really good at this, and sometimes we underestimate the accountant's view of it. Benefits analysis, really challenging.
Okay. Okay, we're going to talk about culture shift and change management. Are people buying into change more post-pandemic?
Wow.
Who wants to take that one? Shane?
Sure, I'll take it. Well, for the most part, after interviewing countless executives, I've come to the realization that they, over time, got used to a process. And this process got them to the success they are right now. To change that kind of feels like blasphemy, honestly. And I could understand their perspective. However, they're risking their companies either flatlining or completely declining. So when I look at it, I actually think that they are open to change when discussing it, but privately, they're trying to move as slow as possible. They're trying to ensure that it succeeds, and sometimes it actually hinders the potential of any projects that they plan to do. Because if a project takes 2 years, then you're already way behind in the world of technology.
That makes sense. I mean, we have a phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And like you say, if those companies are doing well and they're successful, why do change for the sake of change almost?
Well, they always reach a point of downturn. The world literally changes, and because of that, your processes that you have in place are only based off of previous historical data. Now, when new data comes about and you don't actually care to learn the reasons why it happened and why it changed, if you're more focused on just keeping exactly the same processes, you're going to fall into the trap of being okay with the status quo, and the status quo is equivalent to dying as a company.
Yeah, of course. And this is something that you touched on a lot, actually, in your presentation, Sunil, talking about change. Well, that was change that was almost enforced, for instance, when you were talking about, petrol stations, for instance, and retail. So the same question to you, really. Are people buying into that change more post-pandemic, or in digital transformation in general? Is that really accelerating this change?
Yeah, so Scott, you're right? So I think typically if you think of change, think of push and pull, right? So I think till now what's happened is we were pushing for change. We were telling companies and individuals and societies that you need to change, you need to do things differently, become more digital. And yes, we could even quantify some business value on maybe you can save on travel costs, you can spend more time with your family, you can actually maybe swim in the evening and relax. But then what COVID did is it brought in the pull aspect as well. Suddenly, it became a pain point, which means unless you become digital, you can't be, let's say, meeting a client. Unless you're digital, you can't be, let's say, traveling to, let's say, Asia to attend a conference. So what this sudden pull made is, it made you come up with technologies which will enable you to do things, which means you can still visit a client, let's say, in Germany. You can still actually talk in a conference in Singapore without having to physically travel because of COVID restrictions. So I think This particular push made it more and more easy for companies, organizations, society to change. So I'll give a quick example, right? So typically when I used to attend or talk at a conference in Singapore, I'll spend 3 days just to go to Singapore for 2 hours of speaking. And that was pretty much mandatory. There was no excuse I could do it online. And maybe I could come up with a business benefits of I would save emissions, I could actually save costs and so on, but that still will not fly. But now with COVID, which is more of that push, there is no aeroplanes, we can't fly anymore. But the conference providers still want to bring in that thought leadership there to the audience. So the only way you could do it is digitalization. So I think as long as there's a combination of push and pull, both supporting you, change will happen. But if one of them doesn't happen, it's very difficult to change.
And which is more powerful, the push or the pull?
Very, very good question again, right? So it all depends on the scenario. It's easy for us to think that the push is more powerful, but it depends on whom you're talking and at what level you're talking. At a day-to-day basis, you're right, push is more powerful, which means if it's a pain point, there's no flights, I have to do it online. But sometimes at senior levels, and you would see a lot of CEOs focusing on bottom line, top line, and sustainability and emission reduction. For them, a particular pull is important as well in terms of is it helping them improve their bottom line and so on and so forth. And that's where the quantification of business benefits. And when I say business benefits, it's the balanced scorecard type of a business benefits of financial benefits, environmental benefits, society benefits. And that is still important for some of the senior suites that we talk to.
Yeah, sustainability is a really good point there. So I'll come to you in a second, Shane. So sustainability, obviously there's a lot of push there. There's a lot of pull as well. So when it comes to that, how do you think sustainability is panning out? Shane?
Sustainability specifically?
Yeah.
Well, for that, personally, I personally do not have a standpoint on sustainability. More so, I had initial thoughts on one of the comments that he made. So the comment was that promising companies that we are helping your bottom line. And the thing is, we're all promised that daily. I'm pretty sure everyone in the audience gets LinkedIn messages saying, hey, we'll 3x your sales, or we'll reduce your spend in some aspect. And honestly, at a certain point, companies want more than that. And just promising some slight increase in gain for some experimental technology may not always be enough for them.
So what kind of change or improvements would they be looking for in that instance, rather than these marginal gains?
From my experience, they like certainty. They like guarantees. They like when I state that, hey, at minimum, we will increase it by this much at no cost to you. And when you pitch them new technologies that can't always gain that same type of trust, that credibility, that insurance, that's when they become more hesitant with trying out new technology.
I suppose if you can guarantee or ensure a benefit, then it's a no-brainer, right? Of course they're going to take it.
Yes, of course. You make it so easy that you just cannot reject the offer. However, the thing is, with technology, you can never fully promise that. So it puts into a very particular situation where you can only take safe bets, marginally improve performance, and when you want to do large gains, that's when the executives tend to get a little bit more shy when it comes to making these big decisions.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting your specific point there about change and embracing change in the pandemic, I think is fascinating. I saw a really interesting article that said some elements of the pandemic have driven what was called plastic change, i.e. you've bent it so far that it's not going to spring back, so it's stopped and we're there. Other areas, there's been elastic change, so it's still bent and it's still held there by the pandemic to some extent. And to me, the real trick is to work out which bits of that you want to make plastic. Because we will spring back. The human race, people, behaviors, habits, it takes years to form habits. Your point about CEOs, they promote in their kind, they live in the way they grew up, and they want to deliver the same outcomes. To me, it's kind of working out what you still hold and make it plastic. And the Army are really working out that now. Do we want to be completely out of the office for the rest of Christendom, forever? Is that it? No, of course it isn't. Competent innovation, for example, doesn't happen over teams. It happens around the water coolers, the sort of saying goes. It happens when people come together from different backgrounds and come up with a really cool idea that they didn't think they would. I mean, that to me is the trick. What are we going to keep changed in a digital sense? because we've worked out we can do it that way now.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I want to move on because we are a little bit short of time. I want to talk about the digital ecosystem and the importance of partners. And Stefan, I know this is something that you talked about as well in your session, as did you, Sunil. But so Shane, when it comes to working with partners and having that digital ecosystem, obviously you draw on specializations and strengths that all of those partners have. Do you think that's absolutely the way forward, that every organization needs to work that way?
At this point, due to the changes of COVID, this is more than necessary. If you look at the advertising space right now, we're going through a complete overhaul due to the countless news outlets enraging consumers about privacy. We're getting several of our countless features that we depended on taken away, such as cookies and such as device IDs on Apple devices. All of these things that we need to actually track our ad spend is being taken away. So now more than ever, we actually have to work together with partners and create strategic alliances to actually collect first-party data and work towards a future where we can still achieve certain ROI on ad spend.
Okay. And Stefan, the importance of partners. We talked about SMEs that you're desperate to work with. I'm sure lots of CEOs of SMEs are interested in your speech earlier. So how important is it to you?
Yeah, I think it's hugely important. I mean, the bit that I find most fascinating and the most potential is this idea that we can get across the sector boundaries, though. So rather than digging deeper into the defence sector, which is a very specialist area, obviously, is get across the boundaries. And I touched on it earlier, into fintech or pharma or wherever it is, because there's some great technology out there which would be really good for what we do. The trick, I suppose, the challenge is making a forum or delivering an environment, a safe environment for people to come and see what we do, because it's pretty opaque. We don't talk about a lot of what we do as well. So there's stuff that goes on in bits of the army, which deliberately is, not something we discuss open and widely, because it's all about having an advantage as a result. But we want to bring those people in, trust them, bring them into those safe environments and say, this is what we do, that's what you do. Any idea that those two could cross over? Because I think they will. I mean, the technology is really transportable, yeah? So that's why partnering is important to us. The second part of partnering for us is what I touched on a little bit in the presentation, that the really big players are beginning to get more end-to-end for us. So rather than going to multiple different organizations to take you through the journey of a discovery into an alpha, beta, and beyond, we're now finding that some of our big partners that we've worked with traditionally, consultancies often, but some of the big manufacturers as well, can take you right from discovery all the way through to live service and indeed retirement at the end. That sounds like it's quite narrow, but what it gives us is it gives us surety. And if you can get into a partnership that's that strong, it also does something really critical, which protects the IP for us. Because I suppose one of the concerns that I have as a chief data officer in particular is not so much the loss of the data, but the loss of the access to example for code or an algorithm or a particular piece of AI. Because if we don't own the IP sovereignty to it, if it isn't owned by the Ministry of Defence, it could be pulled at any time. And if it sits in that loop I talked about earlier in terms of speeding up our decision making, and you extract it from that loop, and all of a sudden that hour and 40 minutes I touched on is back, that's not good. So yeah, I think partners are great. We've got loads of brilliant partners though, I should always say that. I mean, it's not like we're trying to build something that doesn't exist. It's just about improving the current ecosystem.
And I think I can add a bit of a different flavor, right? So I think we spoke about the value of partnership, and I'll cover that again. But thinking about it in terms of a network effect, right? So is that E raised to N, where E is exponential and N is the number of partners in a network. So as a particular company, I can give X value to another company. But if I actually can do it in a partnership, it's E raised to N, which means the value will be at exponential level. And I'll tell you why. The second aspect around is the business around it, right? So I think as we go to a particular business problem in a partnership or in an ecosystem or a collaboration, suddenly you are able to get the best of skills from a specific partner. You're able to get the particular geographic reach of a specific partner, as well as you're able to get, let's say, specific new technologies and innovation as well, which typically is very difficult for one company to do. Even as Stephen said, right, one integrated large company also may not be able to provide all of that. And that's where we are ourselves a big proponent of partners. We work with most of the startups, many of the other technology companies, because we think that to provide a solution, you need to have the best of different things. And that's where I think partnership is really important.
Yeah, and we've seen some real change recently. We touched on it in the panel I was on yesterday. So we've really begun to see very big organisations working together in a way that we've not normally seen. So a small example would be British Telecom are supporting us at a site, an army site, which we're turning into a smart base. So we're building technology into the site as a concept demonstrator. And there's all sorts of great stuff on there. But they're now working in partnership with Microsoft and Apple as well, and others, to come and all join the party. Because they've got their own specialist skills, as you say, particularly, so for example, the mobile platforms that Apple are bringing completely transform the potential of that site because of their edge compute capability and some of the other things they can bring that you don't get from an Android-based platform. So those types of partnerships are new, but they're the future as far as I can see.
Okay, and when it comes, you touched there on iOS and Android. This is something that, Shane, I imagine you have a vast experience of. What's your view on that, and also the idea of partners and partnerships and how important they are?
Well, at this current point in time, at least as it comes to the mobile advertising industry, at this point, the mobile advertising industry is kind of being strangled. It's being taken advantage of by Apple, unfortunately, because they now have control of the device. They can say, hey, if you want to advertise now, you have to go through Apple, and they have that new proprietary data that was previously open. Android, on the other hand, tries to keep a very open relationship with the developers that they work with. So if you need access to data, you can partner with different app developers on the platform and collect a massive sum of data. Versus with Apple now, it's becoming strangely acute to only Apple owning that data.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously most mobiles do use Android as their platform. Is it more a case that Apple and iOS, their users are seen as more valuable when it comes to mobile advertising?
Well, traditionally, Apple devices, their users spend more, traditionally. However, Apple has a unique brand that incentivizes a certain class of individuals who happen to have more disposable income to then spend when they see ads. So traditionally, yes, it has always been seen as a more valuable place to advertise on.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've got an Android, and I'm really tight, so that does make sense. Okay, just move on to the last question before we take some questions from the floor. This is about insourcing and outsourcing. What is the best solution? And I realize this is not a yes or no answer. So, Sunil, turning to you first.
Yeah, so I'll quickly start with a very academic reply and then connect it to the business reply, right? So from academic point of view, if you've read Michael Porter, right? So it's all about the value chain and your core competencies there. So if you think about it from a value chain, from all the way from where you actually get a raw material to process something to distribute it, you need to look at what elements of the value chain are valuable and are your core differentiators. So as long as you're clear that, let's say, if I'm an Apple and research is what differentiates me, you would typically insource it. But if there's a particular element in the value chain which is not strategic in your vision, so for example, it could be managing technology, which could be mundane technology, which is not my core, I could outsource it. So it's all about assessing the entire value chain, figuring out your core competencies, where you differentiate in the market, and then figuring out the areas that you wouldn't differentiate and are mundane and can be better done by outsourcing, by their economics of scale, innovation, and so on. And that's typically a model most of the large organizations look at. The second aspect there is that again is getting disrupted, right? The typical value chain approach is disrupting with what we said about ecosystems and partnership, but that similar flavor does exist. So even in a partnership ecosystem, there could be some elements you may still not think is core and you may still outsource. And we see a lot of that happening in a lot of the ecosystems we are working on. And I think that's a model you may need to think about. What is valuable to you? What differentiates you in source? What is not valuable? And what can be done better by a partner? Outsource.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Would you agree with that, Stefan?
No, I do agree. I mean, there's two prisms to look at it through from an armed force perspective, which might be interesting. So the first one is, what do you need to go and do your job overseas in warfight? You know, what is critical to the delivery of combat power is what we talk about. And you keep that in-house. Yeah, you don't want to give that up. That's sovereign, and you hold on to it. And then everything else, in theory, you can outsource. The other lens that I look at through is a little bit of what we've touched on already. It's around this sort of sovereignty issue. It's about, if you do outsource, can you outsource it and retain sovereignty, though, over the ability to either regrow it if you need to because the situation changes, and also to retain the sovereignty over your data. And I think that that is an area which is increasingly easy to do. It wasn't in the past. It's a bit to your point about organisations wanting to collect data. They were collecting it from the army, but not sharing it with the army, which was quite obscure when you look at it. It's our data. We created most of it. That's the other lens I look at it through. Increasingly not an issue, but certainly something we have to keep checking, though, because it's to my point earlier, those boundaries between the stovepipes that we introduce in the way we structure the organisation are not there for the data. It flows seamlessly over them. So the minute you start leaving data in silos, you've missed the point. There's my two lenses. Yeah.
And Shane?
Well, when I'm normally discussing the pros and cons of doing it in-house versus outsourcing it, I normally take it back to the company at hand. A lot of times, companies try to replicate Google and Facebook and all the nice fancy tech companies. However, a lot of times when they bring in data scientists, bring in PhDs, engineers, they end up just creating cost centers. What they fail to realize is that engineering is a part of the core DNA of a lot of tech companies. If you're not a tech company, you have to adjust accordingly or you risk cannibalizing your own business itself. You're creating a cost center by hiring all these engineers and you're underutilizing them. So essentially, you have to know your positioning as a company. And if you know technology is not one of your core strengths, then you outsource it. You leverage the skills and expertise of others rather than risking harming your own company.
Yeah, again, makes perfect sense. Okay, right, I'm going to turn to some questions. I want to try and wrap this up in the next 5 minutes or so. I'm just going to take a couple of questions on here, but if anyone has a question in the audience, if you can put your hand up now, then we can get a microphone over to you. So one of the questions I have here is, what are the most common pitfalls that companies face when formulating a tech strategy, and how can they be avoided? So common pitfalls and how can they be avoided? In 1 minute, please.
I can do a quick start because that's what we do every day. So I think it all boils down in terms of the particular ambition of a company, right? So there are companies, as we rightly said, right? Everyone wants to be the Google, everyone wants to be the Amazon, the Apple, or whatever. And I think that's because we hear about them so much in the press. So what I think one of the big pitfalls we see is more and more companies think that they can do everything, and we spoke about that. There are surely areas that others can do better. I think we have seen more and more companies thinking their IT strategies, I can do everything in that IT strategy. I can do better than anyone else out there, and I can be the next Google or the Apple in everything I do. So I think that's something we see more and more a lot, and I think that's because of the way these companies have been positioned as they have done something so successfully and they have grown to trillion-dollar companies now, and that's something we still keep seeing. It's changed in the last 2 or 3 years based on some of the discussions we have had, some of the experience we have shared on who can do things better, what business value you can get by outsourcing and so on. But that is still one of the big pitfalls we see of companies still thinking they can do everything. And some of them have been based on having burned their fingers on where they have outsourced it somewhere 5,000 miles away, and they thought that the problem is solved. But as I think Stephen said, that the problem is not solved. You still are in control. You still have to govern that team that is 5,000 miles away. And that's where some of these end companies realize, I need to now do everything in-house. So that's where I think there is a lot of education, looking at their current business model and figuring out what the best for them is what is really needed.
Okay, great. Were there any questions from the floor? Okay, great. I'll carry on with these then. I'm going to ask this one to Stefan, because I know this is something you have actually done. The question is, how vital is it for large incumbents to invest in innovation labs?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what I touched on earlier. It's the space where people can play safely, isn't it? If you can't offer that, and you can't offer it at virtually no cost, I think, then you won't get the best possible representation coming to you to help you innovate. The other bit about innovation, that whether that sits in a lab or not, that I find quite challenging for the army, is the sort of bottom-up innovation. So it's almost the lowercase innovation. It's sort of doing better rather than doing different. It's a sort of in McKinsey land, it's sand, isn't it? You know, rather than rocks and boulders. And I think that is the challenge now, today, in a technology world where you can empower your people low down with Power Platform or whatever you choose to use, low and no code, and they can get on and innovate. It gets like the Wild West, right? I mean, out there, everybody's building something, and they're all replicating each other. There's no scalability. So we are really thinking hard at the moment about how we want to put a glass ceiling on it rather than an opaque ceiling, so people can look up and say, right, we can really do this. Let's go for it. We've got to catch it at some point, though, the innovation, and say, right, stop. That's in our language. That's what we say on the ranges when we're firing. Stop, and close in. We will now look at this for the whole organisation. So bottom fed is a bit of a challenge, but yeah, very important.
Okay, great. And one final question for Shane. Have you been proactive or reactive with digitalisation? It might be organisations that you work for rather than yourself. And has the pandemic drastically changed the face of business models and the agility of large enterprises?
Well, yes, COVID definitely incentivized a lot of companies. It's actually much, much easier to have conversations with them because they realize that, hey, a drastic change can occur at any moment without any signs prior. And at this current time, I'm normally very proactive with what could be possible. Now, the executives have to be the one to decide, are they able to commit to the timeline of deciding these technical innovations that are necessary for your organization, can you commit to actually seeing its completion, making sure it's accepted throughout the organization by a certain timeline? Else, if it's taken 5, 10 years to complete, it's honestly not worth it at that point.
Okay. All right, listen, we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid, but it's another great session. Thank you all so much. So please show appreciation for Sunil, Stefan, and Shane. Thanks, guys. Okay, and Shane is actually going to be appearing on our digital stage later on today, so make sure you don't miss that. We're going to take a couple of minutes now to reset the stage before our next speaker, who we're going to try and get on in around about 5 minutes. So we'll see you then. Thanks.